Happy Sabbath, everybody, and once again, welcome to our English worship today. This morning, we are going to begin our look at the book of Ecclesiastes. Last month, we did kind of a short overview of the book. Today, I'd like to look at some ideas and lessons that we can learn from chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes. And that's found on page 647 in our English Bibles, if you'd like to turn there and look at the chapter as we talk a little bit about that together today. The title of my sermon today is, What's the Point? And this is kind of the question, or the theme, or the observation that Solomon makes in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes. And today I'd like to look at some of the verses in chapter 1 and talk about some of the themes and the questions that Solomon asked, and consider some possible answers to some of these questions as we study together this morning in chapter 1. Now, the very famous verse that we find in verse 2, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. In Old English it was vanity, vanity. And the original word that's used in Hebrew, it actually means something like smoke, or puff of air, or soap bubble. Something which is transitory, something that has no forms. It's not something you can grab onto or get your hands around. And Solomon starts out by making this general statement, this general thesis about what life is like on this world. And not exactly the most positive message. It's one that you would think, well, you know, he was such a wise guy. He was one of the most intelligent men that ever lived. He studied many things. He explored many different aspects of life. How could he come to this conclusion? And yet, as Solomon looked at life, as he looked at the world in which we live, he saw some patterns. And the first thing that he talks about in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 is some of the patterns that he observed in nature. And how when we look at the earth, things don't really change. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. Every day, the same cycle is repeated. And he talks about several different aspects of nature. The sun, the daily course, the yearly course. So predictable that we can make a calendar. He looked at the wind. The wind goes from place to place, and we don't even really know where it goes. And yet, there's a pattern in the wind. And for those people who are sailors, they have to study the wind patterns and chart those wind patterns if they're going to use a sailboat. It was an endless cycle of wind. And he saw the same thing when he looked at the pattern of the use of water. The rain would fall, the water would run into the rivers would flow to the ocean, and the cycle would continue as evaporation of the water up into the clouds. And as he looked at these cycles in nature, it seemed like it was endless, without any particular point or direction. It was just something that continued again and again and again. And there are some religions that have evolved from observing these kinds of endless cycles in nature. In Hinduism and in Buddhism, you have this idea of the endless cycle and reincarnation of life, where people live and die and are reborn again. And that's not really the most, to me, it doesn't seem like the most optimistic way to go. The idea of slowly going up and down the ladder, depending on how good or how badly you do, just having to do it over and over again. Have any of you ever seen an old American comedy called Groundhog Day? See a few people nodding their heads. It's a comedy, and in this comedy, this man has to relive the same day over and over again. He's trying to find something that he can change, and if he changes it in the right way, he can escape. And the movie just shows all the different things that he tries to do on that day. Some days he does bad things, and sometimes he does good things, and it just continues in an endless cycle until finally, through some combination of things, he's able to find the solution and escape. I don't know. To me, I wouldn't want to live in a Groundhog Day. I think that there's more to life, and there should be something more appealing than simply repeating the same thing over and over again and trying to not make the same mistakes again. And yet, this is what some religions promote, based on this endless cycle that they see in nature. And as Solomon looked at this, he looked at some of the aspects of human existence and human life. We are living in this world which has this cycle which never ends. And he saw some problems, or what he considered to be issues, which cause life to lack purpose or meaning. And one of these was the lack of satisfaction. We are sensual creatures. We have input from the things that we see, the things that we hear, the thing that we touch, that we taste, that we smell. We receive these sensory inputs, and they give us pleasure and joy. Sometimes they disgust us. We have good and bad inputs. And that's one thing that makes life exciting, is that we have so many different senses that we receive input from, and we receive a lot of stimulation. And yet, Solomon observed, as he looked at human life and human condition, that by nature, we are never satisfied with the things that we sense. And that leads to problems. It leads to imbalances. For example, food. God gave us food. Many kinds of food with many kinds of flavors. Many rich tastes. And food can be a wonderful thing. But some people eat too much. I include myself in that sometimes. You know, it tastes good. Oh, I want one more. One more bite. One more piece. And, you know, we have a tendency to overload, to overdose on our senses. And doctors tell us that most times people overeat. And here in Japan, there's the idea, at least in Okinawa, that when you eat 80%, then that's good. You're supposed to stop eating when you've eaten 80%. When you've eaten 80%, when you're 20% hungry, that's enough. You should stop. And of course, one of the things that surprises many Westerners when we come to Japan is how little Japanese eat. I can remember going to the company and sitting down next to one of my Japanese co-workers, a guy as big as me, and he pulls out a little lunchbox. It's about like this big, with like a little square of rice and a little tiny foil with some pickled vegetables and another little small tiny pack with a little bit of chicken or something fried. And I can remember looking at that more than once and like, how can you survive? How can you survive on that? That's like one portion for an American, your whole lunch. And of course, going to Japanese restaurants, when we compare serving sizes are much smaller here than in Western countries. And of course, the opposite is true as well. You go to the United States or other Western countries, and you see people gorging themselves. Whenever I go home, my parents always take me to their favorite buffet. And it's just stunning how much people eat in America. They have this big tray, and they have like 2 or 3 plates, and they pile it all up. And then it's like, well, that was round 1. And it's no wonder that obesity in the United States is pushing 70% now. Because people simply eat without controlling their appetite. As long as it smells good and tastes good, they keep shoveling it in their mouth. And that leads to a lot of problems, even with healthy food. And this overdosing on pleasure becomes more and more dangerous as you go out into other things. People get into using drugs, and they start out with a little bit. And then it keeps, their body develops a tolerance, and they keep taking more and more and more to reach a higher level of pleasure. And they're never satisfied. And sometimes people will do this until they make themselves completely sick, and even kill themselves when using things like drugs and medication, overdoses. And even people who are very young and very healthy have destroyed themselves through this overloading of their senses, wanting more, never being satisfied with what they have experienced. And when we look at this lack of satisfaction, it can apply beyond just that. We look at things like knowledge and education. People are always wanting to learn more and study more. And now we have the internet, where you can do all kinds of searches to find more and more information. And it's easy to spend hours and hours looking and trying to find out more details and more facts about whatever it is you're studying. And of course, there's nothing wrong with studying, but there is no end. There's always something more that you can find, and always something more that you can learn. And so people are not satisfied, because as they discover more, they find that there are more questions that they want answers to. And of course, we can talk about money. How many people like money? Yeah, we all like money. And money's a very important thing. It's a very useful tool. It's necessary in the society that we live in today. And there's nothing wrong with money. But sometimes people obsess about it. Oh, I want more money. I want more things. I want newer. I want better. And we hear ridiculous examples, like some movie star who has thousands of dresses or thousands of pairs of shoes. We collect. My girlfriend complains about that I collect things. You have all of these books. Look at all these books. Are you ever going to read all of them again? Well, I don't know. Maybe I will. Some of them I might use for classes or teaching. Oh, they just take up space. You should get rid of them. Like, no, leave my books alone. But there are always more. I go to Amazon and look and wow, oh, there's a neat book. And oh, wow, this one is, I'd really like to read this. So I stay away from Amazon or I would spend too much money. But even free books. I like ebooks and I download free ebooks from different websites. And I have probably 30 or 40 books that I downloaded in the last couple of months that I'm waiting to read on my pocket PC as I have time. There's no end. There's always something more that attracts us, and we want to have that something more, something new beyond what we already have. And so this lack of satisfaction drives us. And as we talked about before, our society promotes this unhappiness because companies want us to buy more and spend more on their products. Another point that Solomon noted as he observed the human condition was, there's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. Now sometimes people read that and like, well, that can't be true. I mean, look in the last 40 years, 50 years, even during my lifetime. Technology has expanded by leaps and bounds. My first computer, tiny amount of memory, very slow. And now, I carry around a pocket PC which has probably 100 times the memory or 1,000 times the memory of my first PC 30 years ago. And computers and technology is expanding so quickly that it's impossible to keep up with it. 25 years ago when I was teaching high school, there were only a few computer magazines, and I could sit down in the library once or twice a week and read through those 3 or 4 main magazines, and I could kind of keep up with all the technology and the software and the hardware that was being developed or that was for sale. Today, impossible. There are hundreds and thousands of websites and online magazines, and there are so many kinds of technology and so many different applications and so many kinds of new hardware being developed that there's no way you can keep up with it. And so when we look at technology, we kind of think, how could this be true? But Solomon wasn't talking about our tools. He wasn't talking about technology. He was talking about human nature. And if we look at the stories from the Bible, if we see how people lived thousands of years ago, it's not all that different from how we live today. We see the same kinds of conflicts between brothers. We see the same kinds of tensions between husbands and wives. We see the deceit and dishonesty even among good people. And their age-old stories and age-old patterns. Man's tools and technology changes, but his basic nature does not. And as Solomon observed the life around him and the people around him, he realized that people don't change. And people don't learn. They repeat the same mistakes again and again. Which leads us to the third point, the lack of remembrance. People don't remember. Now, if I asked some of you to tell me about some of your relatives, like, oh, tell me about your father, well, probably most of you could do that. If I asked, tell me about your grandfather, well, I would guess a large number of you could do that. But if I asked you, tell me about your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather, suddenly people would go silent. Most of us have very little knowledge about our ancestors. We know maybe our immediate family and maybe one generation or perhaps 2 generations. But if you go beyond that, most people don't even know the names of those people. When I was in high school, for my biology class, I had to make a family tree. We had to choose some aspects like hair color and eye color, and we had to draw a family tree showing how these genetic traits were passed down from generation to generation. So I was forced to talk to my parents and grandparents, like, oh, tell me about my great-grandfather. My grandmother's like, oh, let's see, what color was his eyes? People don't remember. And as a historian teaching history, it's very clear. When I would teach high school students in America, you ask some really simple questions about history, and they're like, I don't know. I don't remember that person, that place. Clueless. People don't remember. And when we look at history, we go to these places that have ancient monuments. I mean, sometimes we can find a few statues or a building or a tomb. And even some of the greatest people from history, all we know is their name. We know nothing about their lives and their accomplishments because none of the records for some of these civilizations have survived. People forget. Whether it's someone famous, someone directly related, people don't remember. And it doesn't matter how much you do in your lifetime. Probably in 3 or 4 generations, most people will not know who you are. And your knowledge and memory of you will probably mostly disappear. Now, of course, with the internet and Facebook and these various things, perhaps the memory of some people will last a little bit longer online. But for the most part, you will be forgotten. And as Solomon observed this, he felt that that was something that seemed quite unfair. Now, as Christians, You know, we look at these observations that Solomon made, and we have to understand a very key point. Solomon was describing the world, and he was describing the problems with people in the way that the world relates to things. He was looking at these questions from the angle of, how does the world view us? How does the world view life? And as Christians, we are not living in an endless cycle. We are not like little hamsters on the treadmill running in the cage. We know that God created us. And in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, it says, long ago, before He made the world, God chose us to be His very own through what Christ would do for us. Even before the creation of the world, God had plans for each one of us. He knew about us from the beginning, and He had a plan for us from the beginning. And the plan of salvation was put in place even before the creation of the world. God had a plan, and He had a safety net for man designed from the very beginning. God created us. He created the world for us to enjoy. And God has a purpose for each one of us. He has a plan for each one of us. He has multiple plans for each one of us in order to be happy. We need to understand as Christians that this life is not just a one-time cycle and then it is gone and done. This life is a preparation time. It's a time for us to get ready for eternity. We are preparing now for a life everlasting. And if this is what life is going to be like for us here, I think there are some things that we need to do in order to maximize and to gain the greatest happiness as God wants each of us to discover in our lives. And the first thing is to get to know God. We have to know who God is and what He is like if we are going to develop a relationship with Him. And in John 1, verses 12, we read, to all who receive Him, Christ gives the right to become children of God. If we will open our lives and open ourselves, God will make us part of His family. We can know Him. And that means communicating with Him. And how do we communicate with God? Prayer. Study of His Word. Enjoying the world in which He is made, going out into nature. If we take some of these simple steps, God will reveal Himself to us, and we can know who He is and what He wants us to be more like. Which comes to point number 2. Become like Christ. Christ is our example. As we study His life, as we see how He lived, as we read how He worked with people and treated people, as we review the values that He taught, we can become more and more like Him. As we behold, we are changed. As we study something and focus on something, it's easier to become more and more like that. If you are a sports person, often they talk about visualizing. You know, before you hit the ball or before you catch the ball, in your mind, you have to create an image of that action. You have to think and concentrate and see in your mind what you are trying to accomplish. And that kind of visualization, if you repeat it again and again, it helps your body develop the necessary muscle memory to hit or to swing or to catch in the best and perfect way. And as Christians, we have to do that kind of visualization. We have to look at the life of Christ. We have to embrace His teachings. And if we do that on a daily basis, we are going to slowly be changed more and more into His likeness. It's something that simply can't be helped. It will be a natural process if we open ourselves to Him. And part of becoming more and more like Christ is serving other people. Practice serving. Christianity is not just an introverted religion where you study and learn and absorb and you're like a little rock. What does the Bible say? You know, Jesus said, you know, the water of life, if you drink this water, what it'll be? It'll spring out. It will bubble out from you to other people. If you are truly becoming more and more like Christ, you will naturally serve as He did. We watched the movie last week about the book of John, and we saw some examples of that service. And of course, some of the more famous scenes, the Last Supper, where He washed the feet of His disciples. And as Jesus told His disciples, if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, you have to be the servant of all. Service, Christian service, reaching out to other people, helping them in any way that we can, brings blessing to them as well as to ourselves. As we serve other people, God will use us and bless us and help develop the talents necessary for the work that He has called us to do. It doesn't matter how big or how small the task. Apply yourself with all of your strength and all of your ability. All of us can serve in some way. And finally, share with other people. We need to let other people know the secret that we have discovered. We have found a key to happiness. And people want to be happy. And sometimes people will see that you are happy and they'll ask you, what's your secret? Why? Why are you always so positive? Or why are you always smiling? Tell me, I want to know. We need to learn how to share. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have to all stand up and become preachers, but you need to be able to express your own relationship, your own feelings, your own connection, a personal testimony about what God means to you and why you are a Christian. And if you are willing, and if you ask God for the opportunities, He will give them to you every day. You will have chances to meet people at home or at work or at school, on the train. If you are willing to be used, God will use you as a channel, as a medium to reach out to other people. Jesus has died for the sins of the world. Jesus is coming again. Jesus is providing an answer to each and every one who's willing to reach out and accept and take what He is giving. And this is the news that we need to be sharing each and every day. No matter where we are or who we're talking to, we all have the opportunity to witness. And there are people who are looking and searching for the truth, for satisfaction, for happiness. And if we are true witnesses, even to a small degree, with a small light, we can bring others to Christ. Thank you.